I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
Washington is weighing up its options. Behind closed doors, the question is no longer if the United States will act, but when. Multiple reports now suggest that a U.S. strike on Iran could come within the next 24 hours. Well, this comes on the 17th day of deadly protests across the country, protests that have shaken the Islamic Republic and called for an end to the Ayatollah's rule. Tehran, meanwhile, is issuing warnings. It says it's ready to defend itself against any foreign threat. In Washington, the mood has shifted. President Donald Trump has held several meetings with his advisors. After those meetings, the possibility of a U.S. strike moved from theory to planning. Reports say Washington is ready to go ahead.
I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
Iran just unleashed the most catastrophic assault on American targets we've ever witnessed. And Trump's declaration of a national emergency shows us we're standing at the edge of a conflict that could explode into full-scale war at any second. For weeks, Trump has been issuing warnings to Iran over its brutal crackdown on civilian protesters and mass executions. But instead of backing down, the Iranian regime just crossed a line that changed everything, launching coordinated airstrikes on 3 major U.S. cities and 1 massive demonstration strike in an unpopulated area as a show of force.
Yet despite reports that the death toll has crossed 12,000, the U.S. has so far held back. But that restraint appears to be thinning. Just look at the signals on the ground.
It's honestly hard to believe we're even analyzing what such a scenario would look like. This isn't just about one retaliatory attack or one diplomatic crisis. We're talking about the potential beginning of a war that could reshape the Middle East, draw in global superpowers, and cost countless American lives. And trust me, the global reaction will tell you everything about how unprepared the world is for this level of escalation. The stakes have never been higher, the military response more critical, and the potential for catastrophic consequences more real. Let me fill you in on the background that led to such an explosive moment and why understanding this scenario matters for grasping real-world geopolitical risks. Iran has been experiencing massive protests and strikes against the regime. The government's response has been brutal: public executions, violent crackdowns, thousands of civilians killed. The international community has issued condemnations, but the violence only intensified. Trump began issuing direct public warnings to Iran. Stop the executions, stop killing your own people, or the United States will have no choice but to intervene. These warnings, delivered via social media and official statements, grow increasingly specific and threatening over several weeks. But the Iranian regime didn't just ignore these warnings. They issued their own threat. Through official channels, Iran's supreme leader warned that any American intervention would be met with retaliation, the likes of which the world has never seen. The regime would declare that if Trump continues making threats, it will be the last threat the United States ever makes. Trump's motivation was framed around preventing genocide. After watching situations deteriorate in Palestine and Ukraine, he would argue that waiting and watching while civilians are slaughtered is no longer acceptable. This wouldn't be about wanting conflict, it would be framed as a moral necessity to prevent mass atrocities. But before Trump could issue one more warning, Iran acted with shocking speed and devastating force. According to how emergency broadcasts reported it, the attacks would begin at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time, coordinated, simultaneous, designed for maximum psychological impact. The first strike hit a major metropolitan area on the East Coast. Missiles launched from Iranian positions in the Middle East, cruise missiles with the range to reach U.S. targets. The attack would target critical infrastructure, power grids, and communication centers designed to create chaos and demonstrate capability without necessarily maximizing civilian casualties in this first strike. The second strike targeted a major city in the Midwest. Different trajectory, different weapon systems, showing that Iran's reach extends across the entire continental United States. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Evacuations began. Panic spread as Americans realized multiple cities are under attack. The third strike hit a West Coast target, completing a coast-to-coast demonstration of Iran's capabilities. Each strike was carefully calculated and deadly enough to prove serious intent, but restrained enough to leave room for de-escalation. Talk about a coordinated military operation that represents Iran's most aggressive action against America in history. But the fourth strike was different, A massive missile or weapon deployed in an unpopulated desert area, Nevada and remote parts of Arizona. This wouldn't be about causing damage, it was a demonstration, showing the size and power of Iran's most devastating weapons, a message that says, this is what we could do to your cities if we wanted to. According to how things unfolded, initial casualty reports would be confused and conflicting, emergency services struggling to respond to multiple simultaneous attacks, hospitals overwhelmed, communication networks disrupted. Early estimates might suggest dozens dead, hundreds injured, but the true toll would take hours or days to determine. The psychological impact in this scenario is immediate and overwhelming. Americans who've never experienced attacks on home soil since 9/11 would suddenly face the reality that their cities are vulnerable, that distance and oceans don't guarantee safety, that Iran, if it chose to, could strike anywhere in America. Now, this wouldn't be the first time we'd see how quickly diplomatic tensions can explode into military conflict. Throughout history, we've seen this pattern. World War I began with an assassination and a series of ultimatums that spiraled out of control. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink over perceived threats and defensive positioning. The Iraq War began with warnings about weapons programs and regime change demands. This would follow a familiar escalation pattern. Public threats, counter-threats, neither side willing to back down, each action prompting a stronger reaction, until suddenly words become weapons and weapons become war. What this reveals is how fragile peace actually is when both sides believe they cannot afford to appear weak. Trump felt he cannot ignore genocide without betraying American values and emboldening other authoritarian regimes. Iran believed that backing down to American threats would invite invasion and regime change. The pattern shows us that once this escalation cycle begins, off-ramps become increasingly difficult to find. Each action narrows the range of acceptable responses. Each threat makes compromise look like weakness, until the only paths forward are escalation or humiliation. Trump's response would need to be immediate, decisive, and carefully calibrated to avoid either appearing weak or triggering full-scale war. The president would convene the National Security Council within minutes of the attacks. Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Director of National Intelligence, CIA Director all assembled in the White House Situation Room assessing damage, confirming Iranian responsibility, and presenting response options. The national emergency declaration came within hours. Trump addressed the nation from the Oval Office, outlining what happened, confirming American casualties, and declaring a state of national emergency that would activate emergency powers and military readiness protocols. In his speech, Trump would frame the situation carefully. Iran has launched an unprovoked attack on American soil. They have killed American citizens. They have struck our cities in an act of war. The United States will respond with overwhelming force to defend our people and our homeland. The emergency declaration in this fictional scenario would trigger several immediate actions. Military mobilization, reserve units called up, aircraft carrier strike groups repositioned toward the Persian Gulf, bomber wings placed on highest alert, special operations forces deploying to forward positions, homeland defense, fighter jets patrolling American skies, air defense systems activated around major cities, border security heightened, TSA and law enforcement on maximum alert for potential follow-up attacks or sleeper cells. Economic measures, emergency powers to freeze Iranian assets, sanction any entities connected to the regime, and potentially invoke wartime production authorities if the conflict expands. Diplomatic isolation, immediate consultations with NATO allies, calls to the UN Security Council, building international coalition for whatever response comes next. According to how military analysts might assess this situation, Trump would face several response options, each with devastating implications: limited retaliation, strike Iranian military targets, missile sites, command centers, send a message that attacks on America have consequences without triggering full-scale war. Massive retaliation, comprehensive air campaign against Iran's military infrastructure, potentially including regime targets, designed to cripple Iran's ability to conduct further attacks. Full invasion, ground forces deployed to remove the Iranian regime entirely. The scenario that Trump's earlier warnings about intervention would have been building toward. The choice in this timeline would depend on whether Iran signals willingness to de-escalate or continues threatening further attacks. The immediate consequences within the United States would be catastrophic and far-reaching. The casualty count would climb as rescue operations continue. These strikes killed 47 Americans and injured over 200. Not the thousands that could have died if Iran targeted population centers directly, but enough to fundamentally change how Americans view their security. The psychological trauma in this scenario will extend far beyond the immediate victims. Millions of Americans in major cities would suddenly fear they could be next. School closures, workplace evacuations, people fleeing urban areas for rural locations they perceive as safer. The economic impact here would be immediate. Stock markets could crash potentially down 20–30% in a single day as investors flee to safety. Oil prices would skyrocket as the Strait of Hormuz becomes a war zone. Supply chains already stressed would face complete disruption. Air travel could grind to a halt. All flights grounded initially as authorities assess whether additional attacks are coming. When flights resume, passenger numbers would plummet as Americans become afraid to fly or gather in large groups. Most significantly, the social fabric in this scenario would face severe strain. Fear would drive some Americans toward unity and patriotism, but it would also trigger suspicion toward Iranian Americans and Muslim Americans more broadly. Hate crimes would spike. Communities that had nothing to do with the Iranian regime would face harassment and violence. Emergency rooms will be overwhelmed not just with attack victims, but with people suffering panic attacks, cardiac events triggered by stress, and mental health crises. The psychological toll would persist for years. Now here's the real kicker. Iran's attack on U.S. cities has sent shockwaves throughout the entire international system, forcing every nation to choose sides in a conflict that could engulf the globe. NATO allies face immediate pressure to invoke Article 5, the principle that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Accordingly, most European allies would express solidarity with the United States but might hesitate to commit to full military support, fearing they could become targets themselves. Russia and China face critical decisions. Do they support their strategic partner Iran, risking confrontation with the United States? Or do they condemn the attacks while working diplomatically to prevent escalation? Both nations might pursue a middle path, condemning violence while calling for restraint and negotiated settlement. Israel is placed in an impossible position. Iran's attack on America would seem to validate Israel's long-standing warnings about the Iranian threat, but Israel would also need to prepare for Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, militias in Syria, to launch attacks on Israeli territory as the conflict expands. Saudi Arabia and Gulf states face the prospect of becoming battlegrounds. Their territory hosts American military bases that would be launching strikes against Iran. Iran's proxies would almost certainly attack these facilities and potentially Saudi infrastructure directly. Most critically, global opinion is divided. Some nations view this as justified retaliation against American threats and interference. Others see it as an unacceptable act of terrorism against civilians. The United Nations would be paralyzed as Security Council members with veto power disagree fundamentally about responsibility and appropriate response. According to economists, oil markets will enter crisis mode. Iran threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil supply flows. Even if they don't close it, insurance rates for tankers would skyrocket, effectively reducing flow. Oil could hit $200 per barrel or higher, triggering global recession. Trump and his advisors would be weighing options that all carry enormous risks and potential for catastrophic escalation. Option 1. Proportional military response. The U.S. could launch strikes against Iranian military targets equivalent to the damage Iran inflicted, destroy missile sites, air defense systems, military command centers, send a message that attacks have consequences, but leave room for de-escalation. The risk in this scenario are that Iran views this as insufficient punishment and launches additional attacks, triggering an endless cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation. Option 2. Massive retaliation. Trump could authorize a comprehensive air campaign designed to cripple Iran's military entirely. Hundreds of targets across Iran struck simultaneously. Naval forces destroyed. Air Force grounded. Command and control eliminated. The risk in this scenario is that massive Iranian civilian casualties turn global opinion against the US, Russia, and China might feel compelled to intervene. Regional allies become targets of Iranian proxies. The conflict spreads throughout the Middle East. Option 3. Regime elimination. Trump could pursue the complete removal of Iran's government through military force. Special operations to capture or kill leadership combined with invasion forces to occupy Tehran and install new government. The risk in this scenario is that this would require hundreds of thousands of American troops, cost trillions of dollars, result in massive casualties on all sides, and create an occupation situation that makes Iraq look manageable by comparison. The conflict could last decades. Option 4. Diplomatic off-ramp. Trump could simultaneously strike limited targets while offering negotiations, use back channels to signal willingness to de-escalate if Iran stops attacks and agrees to international monitoring. The risk in this scenario is that Trump appears weak. Domestic political pressure demands stronger response. Iran interprets restraint as victory and continues aggression. Trump's decision would need to account for American public opinion demanding vengeance, military advisors warning about escalation risks, allies urging restraint, and the terrifying possibility that any of these options could trigger World War III. Let's break down what this scenario teaches us about how quickly international crises can spiral into catastrophic conflict. First, Iran's retaliation demonstrates that even significant military and economic advantages don't guarantee security. If a motivated adversary is willing to accept consequences, they can inflict devastating damage on American homeland. Second, the escalation dynamics in this scenario show how threats and counterthreats can create situations where both sides feel they have no choice but to act, even when all available actions lead toward disaster. Third, the global implications here reveal that a US-Iran conflict wouldn't remain contained. It would draw in allies and adversaries, disrupt global economy, and potentially trigger the kind of widespread conflict the world hasn't seen since World War II. Here's the deal. Trump's warnings about Iranian atrocities are motivated by genuine humanitarian concerns in this timeline. But the unintended consequence would be backing both nations into corners from which the only exit appears to be through violence. This isn't just about US-Iran relations. It's about how diplomatic failures, miscalculation, and unwillingness to compromise can transform humanitarian concerns into existential threats. Watch out for how Trump balances domestic pressure for overwhelming response against military reality that any response could trigger wider war. Watch for whether allies stand with America or urge restraint. Watch for whether Iran signals willingness to step back or doubles down on confrontation. The stakes couldn't be higher, the room for error smaller, the consequences of miscalculation more severe. This scenario forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about when humanitarian intervention is worth risking war, whether threats can deter determined adversaries, and what happens when two nations convinced of their own righteousness refuse to back down.